Chapter 7, Proteins. This is our final chapter talking about the macronutrients in the diet. We've talked about carbohydrates, we've talked about fats, and so this chapter focuses on protein. There are many functions that protein has in the body. If you look at the table that I've listed here on the slide from your textbook, it will list the many functions, and we've actually discussed many of these in various chapters. For example, proteins are hormones, and we've talked about the hormones insulin and glucagon when we talked about carbohydrates and blood sugar control. Proteins also play a role in regulating the fluid that's in our body. There's a term called edema, which means swelling that can occur when we have extra fluid in the body. And that can happen if we don't have enough protein in our body or muscle mass. The cells actually leak out fluid and they cause it to swell. So we will talk about that when we talk about some ways of malnutrition and not getting enough protein in the diet. This is kind of a characteristic that can be seen. We also talked about proteins being vehicle transporters, taking fat into our arteries in our body. And we talked about lipoproteins, so they were the protein cars that did that. And then there's some other things listed here. Just to note at the bottom, we do know that protein does give us energy or is a source of calories, but it's not the most efficient fuel of the three. And so it does come into play when there are periods when we are in starvation and we're not getting enough. Hopefully that's not happening to us personally, but I'm thinking more in third world countries. But if we don't have enough fuel to make glucose, because that's, remember, the carbohydrate that keeps our blood sugar going, it helps us move our muscles, it helps us think. There's a unique way that protein can actually make glucose in the body. When we look at the structure of proteins, it's very different from carbohydrates and from fats. They're similar also in that they contain carbon, they contain hydrogen, and they contain oxygen. But proteins are the only macronutrient that contain another atom called nitrogen. And you can see a visual picture there of the structure of a protein. Proteins are made up of a series of building blocks, and those are called amino acids. So we have many amino acids that come together to make protein. So an amino acid contains these key elements that you see here. The C that's in the middle that has black around it, that's called the central carbon, and everything hooks onto that. On one side of that central carbon, there is an amino group. And on the other side, there's an acid group. So that's how the name comes into play, amino acid. And then one last thing is that that carbon also attaches to something called a side group. And we're going to see with each amino acid, that side group looks different. It's not important for you to memorize the different C's and H's here. I just want you to be aware that proteins are different in that they contain nitrogen. And they also have this very characteristic side group or side chain in each of its amino acids. The chemical makeup of proteins are more complex than the carbohydrates or fats. So those building blocks I was just talking about, those amino acids, there are 20 of them. And of the 20, 9 of them are called essential amino acids. And if you remember from one of our first chapters, the term essential means that it is something that we must get through our diet, that we actually cannot make it in our body. So there are 9 essential amino acids that we must get from the foods that we consume. And then there are 11 non-essential amino acids, and those are ones that the body can actually formulate or synthesize. It's not important that you memorize the names of the 9 essential amino acids, although I listed them here. But I just wanted you to be aware that there are 9 essential ones. There might be a couple that look familiar to you. Isoleucine, leucine, and valine. Those 3 are packaged together in many supplements, and they are called branch chain amino acids. I had mentioned that proteins are much more complex in their structure and that those amino acids are building blocks that are hooked together or bonded together to make the protein. The bond that links those amino acids together are called peptide bonds. And they're a type of reaction that bring those peptide chains together. They're called condensation reactions. So I just want you to think of amino acids condensing or coming together. So in different foods that you consume that have protein in them, that's already done. Those amino acids are already together. If we have a protein that only has 2 amino acids linked together, we call that a dipeptide. Di means 2, so that means it's 2 amino acids linked together. If there are 3 amino acids linked together, that's called a tripeptide. Again, tri means 3. If there are 4 or more amino acids linked together, which is definitely the most common, those are called polypeptide. So polypeptides are the most naturally occurring proteins, and we call those polypeptides. One other thing that's unique about proteins is that when amino acids link together, they don't just link together in one straight line. They actually coil together, so they have different shapes. This is a good example of a polypeptide that we have in our body. So each of those coils there, the different colored coils, are all separate amino acids linked together to make a polypeptide. This is the most common protein that you will see in the body. It's called hemoglobin, and one of its main functions is to carry iron and oxygen throughout the body. And so we can see how they're coiled together. Those amino acids have to be uncoiled when we are going to digest them. So we will talk about that. When we talk about the proteins in foods, we can classify them as either high quality proteins or low quality proteins. A high quality protein, also called sometimes a complete protein, means that it provides enough of all those 9 essential amino acids needed to support protein synthesis. So if we were to consume a food that had a high quality protein, we would be getting all those needed essential amino acids, and it would help us build protein or muscle in the body. The foods that contain high quality protein are usually your animal-based foods. So that would be your meat, your chickens, anything that they produce. So that would be dairy products, and that would be eggs. There are very, very few plant-based products that contain high quality, meaning they contain all the essential amino acids. 2 that I'm going to mention right now, quinoa and soybeans, they actually do contain all the essential amino acids. However, you would probably need to eat a truckload of either one of those to get the amount that you need to actually, make as much protein as you want. The other form of protein is the low quality protein, or what we also call the incomplete protein. That doesn't mean it's bad and that we shouldn't eat it. It means that there's just not enough of those essential amino acids. They might be lacking 1 or 2 of them, so they can't completely contribute to protein synthesis, but they can help a little bit. But what usually has to happen is there has to be more than one of them consumed at a time. So our plant proteins fall into there, almost all the plant proteins. So for example, if we think of beans and we think of rice, those are two plant sources that contain protein in them. And so what we need to do is complement those, and we can combine plant-based proteins. We don't need to eat them at the same meal, although beans and rice are very nice together. But as long as we're eating different kinds of plant protein sources through the day, we should be able to get enough of all the essential amino acids. I had mentioned that proteins have a very unique structure, that they actually coil together. So when we think about digesting those proteins, our body needs to have a way to uncoil them. And that's why proteins are unique in their digestion, in that they do not digest, as we will see on the next slide, or start to digest until we get to the stomach, because the stomach, remember, is a very acidic environment, and proteins will be able to uncoil in that environment. That uncoiling, the term for that is called denaturation, and it's a disruption of stability. And the two things that can disrupt it is the acid, so think of the stomach, the acidity, or heat is another thing. So they will uncoil and lose their shape. So if we're thinking of just foods and in cooking, we can see by the picture here an egg. When we have a raw egg, the proteins are in one certain state, but heat then changes it. So now you have a cooked egg. So that will uncoil and the proteins lose their shape. If you are a baker or you do anything in the kitchen, there's a way that you can actually take egg whites. You add an acid to it, it's called cream of tartar, and you whip it with a whip, and those egg whites will stiffen, they'll become really fluffy. And you can use something like that for desserts. So we can see it in food, but in our body, we can see that denaturation in stomach acid. So keeping that concept of denaturation or disrupting the stability, your book does go through protein digestion, and we've kind of talked about all the macronutrients and gone through the GI tract. This will break down protein digestion for you. Remember, our mouth and our esophagus, very alkaline environment, so there is not much digestion of protein going on, just the breaking down of food particles into smaller particles. But when we get to the stomach, this is where protein digestion begins, and that's where the acidity, the HCl, will denature the protein or uncoil it. There's also a specific enzyme, remember an enzyme's a helper, called pepsin that is in the stomach, and that will take larger proteins and start breaking them down into their smaller single amino acid units. When we get down to the small intestines, there's a little bit more breaking down going on, but again, we're moving into an alkaline environment, so those proteins are already uncoiled, so we don't need the acidity anymore, but we can break apart those amino acids a tiny bit more in the small intestine. There are specific enzymes in the small intestine, just like there were for carbohydrates. They're called pepsidases, remember aces at the end, and they will again further break down, and then they help with the absorption of protein. What's needed will go directly into the bloodstream and into the cells. Any unused amino acids, because we're down to those single amino acids now, actually are brought to the liver. Remember, all three of the macronutrients have the liver helping them in some way. So the liver, again, is that accessory or helper organ to the digestive tract. So in the liver, This is the site where, remember I'd mentioned those 11 non-essential amino acids can be made. It's called protein turnover. There are two concepts that I want you to be aware of, or two vocabulary words. The first one is deamination. And what that is, deamination, it's the process of taking a nitrogen off an amino acid. And that means that that amino acid is probably going to then go out in the bloodstream and be used. The other vocabulary word is transamination. And transamination means that nitrogen group is taken off of one amino acid and it's put on another amino acid to make the protein that the body needs at that particular time. So once the liver cells have removed that nitrogen, those amino acids are going to be used how they need to be used. That nitrogen has to be taken somewhere. So nitrogen is an atom that we don't need floating in our bloodstream. It's actually, kind of toxic to us. So what our liver cells do is they actually form another product called ammonia, and you might be familiar with that as a cleaning product, but we actually make it in our body as well. And what it does is ammonia will then travel to the kidneys to be filtered out. And there's another process that goes on where ammonia then turns to another component called urea. And hence that's where the word urine comes into play. So the liver will change that nitrogen to ammonia. Ammonia then will turn to urea, and then the kidneys will filter that urea out. We don't want that because there is some acidity in there as well that we don't want to stay in the body. So the reason I bring that up is that if you are consuming a really high intake of protein, you are trying to gain muscle mass, you are drinking tons of protein shakes, you're eating as much beef and chicken that you can, sometimes that extra protein intake, again, will cause that extra urea production because we have so many nitrogens that are trying to get out of the body, and it really puts some pressure on the kidneys. There's also a disease called gout, G-O-U-T, which is actually an accumulation of that urea or uric acid that the kidneys are just having a hard time being able to process through. Some people are susceptible to this, and so we can't get it out of the body, and so it will go and it will collect in really funny areas in the body. If you've known anyone that has gout or has had gout, one of the places that it tends to accumulate is in the big toe, and it's actually very, very painful. So dietarily, we can advise people not to eat as much protein if they are susceptible to something like gout. If you've ever heard of the term kidney stones, that is another thing, another disease that can happen. Sometimes we can see it, that those kidney stones, there are different kinds of kidney stones, and it's when, again, a product is building up and the kidneys can't clear it. There is a type of kidney stone called uric acid stones. And again, that it would be from a very high protein intake. There's too much urea production. It causes it to stay, the kidney, it kind of crystallizes and the kidneys can't get it out. So it can be very, very painful. Kidney stones are not something you want to play around with. So what our body tries to do is to remain in what's termed nitrogen balance or nitrogen equilibrium. And what that is we want to try to balance out the amount of nitrogen that we take in. So again, that really means the amount of protein that's being taken in with how much protein turnover or how much we are losing to either, build muscle or use muscle. So for a healthy adult, that's the goal, is that we want to make sure we're just eating the amount of protein that we need, the amount of calories that we need, and we should then stay in that nitrogen balance. There are occasions when that balance is not balanced, and we could actually find that we are, I'm going to skip to the bottom here, in a positive nitrogen balance. And what that means is that the body is retaining more nitrogen than it's losing. And that can happen at certain times of our life. It's usually times of growth. So we've all been, at least one time in our life, we've been in a state of positive nitrogen balance. So when we were infants and we were developing and growing and starting to crawl and to walk, all of those times our body was holding on and building muscle, and we were in positive nitrogen balance. Also, when we went through puberty, that's a time of nitrogen balance. During pregnancy, when a baby's growing, that's a time of nitrogen balance. When a mom is breastfeeding, again, a time of growth and positive nitrogen balance. On the flip side, the state of a negative nitrogen balance, the definition of that is that the body loses more nitrogen than it is holding on to. And we usually see this, unfortunately, in situations when individuals are not getting, enough food. So we see that in terms of starvation. And actually, the muscles in the body start being broken down to be used as energy. We can see this with serious illnesses, chronic illnesses, cancer, that kind of thing. Also severe injuries, burn victims come into mind that they have to heal all those tissues. When you've heard of second-degree burns and third-degree burns, the body's losing much more. It's trying to replete. So how do we determine how much protein that we need? Well, you've had some experience with your diet evaluations, and your Chronometer app has helped you determine how much protein that you should take in per day with how much activity that you're doing and how old you are and those different attributes. If you remember back a couple of chapters when we talked about the dietary reference intakes, and we talked about, remember the picture of the umbrella that listed all the different categories of the DRIs, the part that was the handle of the umbrella, the AMDR, which stood for the acceptable macronutrient distribution range, said about 10 to 35% of all the calories that we take in should come from protein. So that's a big percentage, from 10 to 35, so everyone's going to be a little bit different. Again, we talked about, with that picture of the umbrella, we talked about the different categories of nutrients and trying to figure out how much we need. I think it's just really important that we look at the RDA, which again, remember, that's what we're recommending for about 97 to 98% of the population. And what's come up is a factor of 0.8 grams per kilogram body weight. It also is per pound. The factor is times 0.36. I'm not really interested in you figuring out a bunch of calculations. This will not be on the test, but I do want you, if you want to know how to determine your own protein needs, it's listed down there at the bottom. You take whatever your current weight is, you divide it by 2.2, and that will change your weight in pounds to kilograms body weight, and then you take the kilograms times 0.8 grams, and that will give you an estimation of how many grams of protein that you need per day. I did mention we were going to talk about malnutrition in the sense of not enough protein and what the ramifications of that can be. We'll also mention a little bit about excessive protein intake as well. So first, when we talk about protein deficiency, I kind of want you to think about third world countries. This is really a form of starvation, although unfortunately we do tend to see some of this in our own society as well. The two forms that I want you to be familiar with that are talked about in your book, the first one is called the kwashiorkor, which is a very big name. And what we see with individuals that have this form of malnutrition is that swollen belly, or that edema I was talking about. So these individuals are actually getting enough calories in, but they aren't getting any of those high quality proteins. So remember, high quality proteins are those meats and chickens and dairy products. So they're getting enough energy, and it's usually in the form of some kind of oatmeal mush type of, wheat protein or something like that. But they aren't getting enough of that high quality protein, and so it stunts their growth, and you will see these individuals with a very large belly. So they don't look like they're wasting away, but they do have that swollen belly. The other form I want you to be aware of is a form called marasmus. That is a Greek word that means slow death. And unfortunately, that's what this kind of starvation actually is. It's very severe. These are individuals, if you were to see them, they would be very weak. They would be wasting away. Their ribs, there would be no fat tissue, would just see ribs and bones. And unfortunately, both of these actually can lead to death, but it really is that second one, marasmus, that is very dangerous. I did mention I was going to make one other comment about excessive protein intake. We had talked about how having extra protein puts stress on the kidneys. Remember that the kidneys filter a lot of things, and they filter fluid as well. So if you are increasing your intake of protein, it's actually super important to keep a lot more water in the body to kind of dilute and eliminate toxic waste from those products. So remember that, urea. So bump up your water intake to prevent dehydration when you are consuming a very high protein diet. The last part of this chapter actually talks about vegetarian diets. So there are actually multiple different types of vegetarian diets. But for the purposes of the class, we are only going to focus on 3 of them. And they are listed here: lacto-vegetarian, lacto-ovo-vegetarian, and vegan. The definitions for those: a lacto-vegetarian, lacto means milk or dairy. So a lacto-vegetarian would include dairy products in their diet, of course, all plant-based foods, but they would not consume any animal flesh. So animal flesh is not just beef and chicken, it also includes fish. So a lacto-vegetarian would consume milk, would consume yogurt, but would not eat meat, would not eat chicken, and would not eat fish. A lacto-ovo-vegetarian, so again, there's dairy in there. Ovo means egg. So a lacto-ovo-vegetarian would include those dairy products plus eggs, but again, no animal flesh. And then a vegan will only eat plant foods. There's no dairy, there's no eggs, no animal flesh, just nuts and seeds and those types of things. In your book, there's a great table that will list the nutritional pros and cons of a vegetarian diet. So I'd like you to look at that. Some of the biggest perks, as I'm sure you can imagine, it's going to be super high fiber, right? Our fruits and our vegetables and our grains, those are all going to be high fiber. It's going to be very low fat. We're taking out all that saturated fat and cholesterol. However, with the dairy products and the eggs, if they're consuming, whole milk, there is going to be some of that saturated fat in there, but high vitamin content as well. The biggest nutritional cons of a vegetarian diet is that it's very low in a vitamin called B12. B12 is only found in animal products. So we see this mostly with the vegans because we still can get some B12 in dairy products. But very low in B12. It's going to be lower in iron. There are actually 2 kinds of iron. The iron that we find in animal products is a much more absorbable type of iron. We're going to learn about this when we talk about vitamins, but it's called heme iron, and we absorb more of it. Whereas our plant based iron, which because we do have iron in spinach and different plant-based, it's considered non-heme, and it's just not as absorbable. You have to consume a lot more of it. So that's another nutrient to worry about with vegetarian diets. And then calcium, especially if you're not consuming dairy products, if you're a vegan. And zinc tends to be in animal products as well. So that doesn't mean that it's the end of the world. It means that supplementation, sometimes a supplement, and then lots of those fortified foods, so foods where those nutrients are added in. One of my favorite foods that I recommend to many of my vegetarian clients is the cereal Total cereal. It is fortified with a gazillion different vitamins and minerals. We've now talked about the 3 macronutrients, and remember those are the nutrients that contain calories or they contain energy. Alcohol is not a nutrient, as we know. It is not necessary to sustain life, but it does provide calories for us. These next couple of slides are taken from Chapter 6. We're already in Chapter 7, but you will be responsible for this section on alcohol with this Chapter 7. As I mentioned, it is a non-nutrient, but it does provide calories, and it's pretty significant that it provides 7 calories per gram. The only nutrient that is higher than that is fat, which provides 9. We do know that the alcohol is classified as a drug. It's a mind-altering drug, but a lot of times people refer to it as food, or it's classified as food. Alcohol is very different than the digestion of carbohydrates and proteins and fat, is that it doesn't require digestion. It readily passes through our tissues, will go through our GI tract. The only thing that really tends to slow it down is food. So it's extremely important that if you are going to consume alcohol, that you actually consume food along with it. Your book does also talk about factors that influence how quickly or how slowly your particular body will metabolize or utilize alcohol. So things such as your body size, how old you are, your gender, all those things will come into play. As I mentioned, alcohol doesn't digest like the other macronutrients do. So its goal is to actually get to the liver, where the liver then will detoxify it. So this slide actually will list step by step what happens in the body. What I want you to know is that the alcohol will pass through, the GI tract, small intestine, it'll absorb through, and it goes directly to the liver. Remember the liver, here we go again with another accessory organ, right? It's helping out, it's helped with all the macronutrients, now it's helping with alcohol too. And the whole goal is that the liver wants to detoxify, because alcohol is considered a poison to the body, and so the liver wants to get it out of there. Because the liver wants to get it out of there, it will try to detoxify alcohol before anything else, so it kind of gets preferential treatment. The problem is that alcohol does not store in the body. So unlike carbohydrates and fats, if we don't use them, we know that they're going to store in the fat tissue. But alcohol doesn't do that, so it will remain in the bloodstream, and the liver will work to detoxify it. Well, if there's too much alcohol coming in at one time, then the liver's working, but a lot of that alcohol will remain in the bloodstream. And so then that, again, is considered a toxin in the body, and it can affect how the body works. So you might, start to have symptoms of too much alcohol in the body. How nutrition can play into this, some effects that alcohol has on our nutrition. There are 3 disease states I want you to be familiar with. The first one is called fetal alcohol syndrome. This is an unfortunate syndrome that can happen if a pregnant woman drinks alcohol while the baby is developing. Alcohol will pass right through to the growing baby. Most damage is done in the first 2 months after conception. And so that's only 8 weeks. So many women may not even know that they're pregnant at that time. So it's very, very important if a woman is in childbearing years to make sure that they're quite aware that this can happen. There are some unfortunate characteristics that we see on children that are born with this fetal alcohol syndrome. There are some facial defects, some heart defects. Unfortunately, they are irreversible. Can't change these things, unfortunately, stunted physical growth. So in terms of how nutrition plays a factor in that, really it is just more awareness to the mom not to consume alcohol if she is planning on becoming pregnant. We've mentioned fatty liver before, and we've mentioned that in conjunction with carbohydrate intake and consuming a lot of really sugary foods with digestion. And that actually is termed non-alcohol fatty liver, but there is a fatty liver that can happen with consuming too much alcohol. So one of the byproducts of the alcohol being metabolized can cause damage to the same liver cells that we saw with consuming too much fat. And it can accumulate, cause fat to accumulate in those cells, and those cells then start to work different. So there's that term fatty liver. So we knew from before that if we cut down on sugary types of things, if we followed a low-fat diet, that could reverse fatty liver, while also making sure we're not consuming alcohol. That would reduce fatty liver. This is the stage where those cells can be healed. It is reversible. So fatty liver is reversible. The disease listed at the bottom, called cirrhosis, is kind of a progression that can happen. And that is where those cells that have changed in the liver over a period of time, they become very hard, they turn color, and they are damaged beyond repair. And so it's irreversible. So it's hardening of actual liver cells. And let me tell you, you cannot live without your liver. Your liver needs to be functioning because it's doing all of these things that I had talked about throughout the class. Many times cirrhosis can be caused by an inflammation of the liver called hepatitis, so inflammation of the hepatic cells. Sometimes that can happen by visiting a different country. Sometimes that inflammation can happen. So it's not just someone that consumes a lot of alcohol, but unfortunately we do see cirrhosis happening in individuals that consume or have an issue with too much alcohol. So the only thing that can happen or that can help change this is a liver transplant. And if that is not something that can happen, the liver keeps continuing to die off, the cells die off. Unfortunately, death is the thing that can happen there.